Good evening and welcome to everybody to another of our marketing and business related webinars from WineGB. This, as many of you will have read, is the first of a series of 3 webinars focusing on routes to market. Coming out of these last few weeks of the pandemic and lockdown, many businesses face the challenge of reassessing their sales plan. Others may well have not finalised their sales strategy and would like to understand which routes to market best fit their aspirations. Tonight's first webinar will no doubt provide an ideal introduction, as it will look at the factors you should take into account when assessing or reassessing your options and consider the key dynamics of each potential route to market. We're really fortunate tonight to be joined by Mike Paul, who has extensive experience across the wine industry in developing sales and marketing strategies. So a very big welcome to you, Mike. Those of you that are now in will see that we're just small windows at the moment, but we've got Mike's slides ready and waiting for him to share with you. All of you that did register should have received these slides ahead of the webinar. If you're a later arrival, don't worry, we can make them available to you afterwards. Just send me a message in the chat room or send me an email. Talking of the chat room, it's always nice for Mike and for me to see people there, so please feel free to say hi, type it into the chat bit. And also importantly, don't forget the Q&A. I'm sure you're all familiar with the with Zoom and the webinars, but you'll see the small Q&A box at the bottom. If you have any question to post, please do. I'll be monitoring them whilst Mike is presenting, and I think, Mike, you're going to be pausing about halfway through, aren't you, just to address any questions?
Yeah.
So I am now going to leave you, Mike. I shall be in the background. I'll be monitoring all the chats and the questions. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Julia, and welcome everyone. I'd like to thank, there's somebody, I won't name them, who they are apparently attending tonight, who pointed out that it was about time I got my photograph updated in the, it came out in the pre-publicity for this webinar. They said either that or you've had a really good lockdown, because you look about 30 years younger. Unfortunately, it was the photograph that was the problem. Right, so as Julia said, this is the first in a series of webinars, and my aim is to give you an overview or an introduction onto routes to market, which is something I really enjoy talking about, as will hopefully be apparent. There's going to be another one on wholesale coming up soon, another one on retailing, and then later on one on export. Export is something I hardly cover tonight, not because of its importance. I quite accept as an industry we really need to be exporting a lot of wine going forward, because for a lot of producers, export is not necessarily relevant at this stage, certainly. Now, the slides have gone out. You will notice, if you've had a chance to read them, that they are quite wordy. I decided to do it that way because I wanted this presentation to stand out on its own, so that you can look at it at your leisure, or you can pass it on to others perhaps who can't attend this evening. What that means, though, is that it may well be that I don't get through the detailed slides at the end. I really want to focus on developing some key themes, and they will become apparent pretty early on, which is why I'm going to pause for questions after about 15, 20 minutes or so. Now, if I do run out of time and you still got questions you'd really like to ask me, then I've said to Julia, I'm happy to go on after 7 o'clock if necessary, but if anybody wants to contact me after the event, Julia has my email, and I'm very happy to answer any questions separately that you may have. Now, you'll notice in these slides, finally, as an intro, there is nothing about COVID-19, this nasty crisis we're going in through at the moment. But actually, it's a catalyst for the whole presentation, as Julia has kind of said. I don't suppose there's anybody out there who hasn't taken or hasn't had to look at their sales plan and give it great scrutiny over the last few months, as this crisis has hit us. And as we come out of this crisis, depending on, of course, on where you are on the spectrum of optimism and pessimism, but as we come out, you're going to have to decide, all producers are going to have to decide whether the tactical changes they made to their sales plan over the last few months are going to become strategic changes, and that's going to be quite tricky. And I would hope this presentation would help with that process. Okay, so an overview. Here, consider your sales plan within the context of your aspirations, capabilities, business plan, and the rest of the marketing mix. Now, I start with this because in my experience of working with lots of producers, and I don't, when I say that, mean simply producers in the UK, I'm talking about internationally here. A lot of people treat their sales plan in a rather ad hoc way, and they give the impression they've got round to it rather late in the day, okay? And what I'm saying is that right at the start of the process, you should develop at the very least a one-pager or even a back of an envelope summary plan, something you've got in your, well, not in your head, ideally down on paper, which you can review and update, and basically implies this is your ideal scenario. We should be very conscious of the fact throughout our businesses that there's always a danger of mission creep. But of course, mission creep implies that you have a mission and you know what your plan is. Otherwise, you won't know where you've come away from the ideal. Now, in the wine business, I hardly need to tell anybody this. It's extraordinarily frustrating, the time between planting a vine and actually getting a bottle of wine to sell. But the advantage of that, one of the few advantages of that time, is that you have plenty of time for planning. There is really no excuse for not coming up with a plan. And I know there are lots of people who would rather spend their time in the vineyards, they'd rather spend their time making wine than have to worry about sales and marketing. But really, that time has got to be used for developing a sales and a marketing plan too. Now, I should add at this point, I always put this slide in wherever I can, because I have one thing in common with good old Abe, is that we're both pretty anal on the importance of planning. Okay, so I really like this. I really like this quote. But now let's move on to some key themes. There are 6 themes I want to develop, and the first one is this. Okay, now anyone who's been involved in English wine for the last 10 years will know up until now that most producers have been in the position where demand has exceeded supply. And now we're getting into a position where supply is building fast, and a key dynamic in the wine industry is going to change, and the chances are it's not going to change in our favor. There's a Dutch bank called Rabobank, who are regarded as one of the experts in the agricultural industry around the world, and the wine industry in particular. And there's a quote from them a couple of years ago which went like this: having demand exceed supply is the strongest position a producer can aspire to. And that implies, of course, the opposite is also true. If you are in a position where you're having to get sales as a response to availability, increased supply, that is not a good position to be in. The dynamics between the buyer and the seller change, and they don't change in your favor. Now, this has huge relevance to the plan, because if you know that your supply, you obviously know what your sales are in the moment, and you obviously know how much supply you have. Now, of course, vintage variability comes into it a lot, but you should know from what vines you've got in the ground what you're going to have in 2 or 3 years' time. That is pretty easy to forecast within parameters. And what you should be doing is building distribution, or attempting to do is building distribution ahead of availability. So ideally, you match supply with demand, okay? I look at it like this. Imagine you're throwing a stone, a pebble, into a pond, and you get the ripples. Ideally, the outermost ripple would be your distribution ripple. And the next one out, fast following it, would be the availability ripple. So you're always shorting the market. You're always, in effect, allocating rather than selling, okay? That is the ideal. It's extraordinarily difficult to achieve that. Before I came into English wine, I achieved that once with the team at Penfolds, okay, where we, throughout the 90s, were in that wonderful position. But it is very rare. And it's something we appreciated necessarily at the time, which is why when I joined the English wine industry as a mentor, I came up with a line that scarcity value is often appreciated after it's gone, okay? One of the great sales maxims of all time is buy now while stocks last, okay? A timeless maxim, right? Something we should all remember, that the perfect situation, as I said, is that you look to build distribution ahead of availability and not simply as a response to increased supply. Now, the rest of the themes are on this page, okay? The first one is optimizing direct-to-consumer sales and hand-selling opportunities. When you consider your brand, when you consider your proposition, your consumer proposition, it is at its strongest, it is shining in all its glory when a consumer comes to your vineyard and they meet you and hopefully the sun is shining and they like the wine. It doesn't get any better than that. That is when your brand has its greatest value. At the other end of the spectrum is when your brand, all kind of lonely, is sitting on a shelf or sitting on a restaurant list 300 miles away, or maybe 3,000 miles away in a different country, surrounded by 300 or 400 competitors all vying for the consumer's attention. Okay, very, very different situations. So optimizing direct-to-consumer sales is not simply about the fact that obviously you take the through profit. You don't have to give it a margin to anyone else, but it's also about the fact that your brand is strongest. Your brand is strongest at home. So that's the second theme. The third theme is, when in doubt, keep it simple. Don't underestimate the complexities of selling to wholesalers or indeed exporting. Okay, that is a step change in your business when you go to third parties. Having said that, also understand the value a good wholesaler or distributor can add. And that goes way beyond their sales and sales expertise. If you wake up one morning and you think, oh no, I've got to spend the whole day packing up and delivering stock, or possibly even worse than that, all those people I've sold wine to over the last months, not enough of them are paying, so they've got to go around chasing for money, right? Then a wholesaler can do all that for you and save you a lot of time and hassle and perhaps money. One of the side issues, unfortunate side issues of the pain that the hospitality sector is going on at the moment is that there could be quite a lot of increase, well, they're likely to be increased credit control problems over the next 6 months. Hopefully not that bad, but we really have to be on our guard. Now, if you're working with a wholesaler, they'll take some of that pressure away from you. Okay. The next theme, understand the dynamics and nuances of the market before entering it. And I'll talk about some of those sensitivities later on, but it makes sense to understand any market, not just the UK. If you're going to export, you obviously need to understand every market, but you need to understand this particular market because, like all markets, it has sensitivities, and you don't really want to be finding them out through experience. The next theme, take soft factors into account when making decisions. It's not obviously all about hard, financial stuff. Let's take an example. Let's say that you are going to, you want to find a local wholesaler, and you've been recommended a local wholesaler, and you go and talk to them, and you seem to be spending an inordinate amount of time having to persuade them that English or Welsh wine has potential. In that case, you're probably talking to the wrong wholesaler, okay? And imagine that, say, a different wholesaler comes to you and you're getting on pretty well, but they come to you and they just don't really seem to get your brand or what you're trying to do, okay? That's probably not going to work either, however good they are in terms of reputation. Empathy with distributors, with third parties is crucial. Ideally, you want them to be an extension of your team, okay? An extra member of your team. And finally, as a theme, don't underestimate your own importance in a mix. In a small company, you are in effect the brand. When I was a wine skills mentor, I met quite a few people who said, look, I love being in the vines, I love making wine, but this sales and marketing stuff, really, I can't get my head around that, and I don't think I'm going to be any good at it. And it's possible that you're not going to be very good at it, but do not underestimate yourself. You're normally a lot better than you think you are. And remember what I said about optimizing hand selling opportunities. The fact that you are there and you are doing the selling adds so much value. It's probably adding a lot more value than you possibly think it is. So do not underestimate your own importance. Okay, moving on. That's what I'm now going to cover. I'm going to look at the route to market in the context of the rest of the marketing mix, and then we're talking about the individual routes to market themselves. The marketing mix, for those who are not sure what this is, because I will be referring to it, it means it's you know, the famous 5. It's the product or the range you're going to sell, the name, your brand name, how you're going to present it, pricing, promotion and communication, and route to market. And the important thing about this is you should be looking at this holistically. There's an old adage in marketing that a brand is only as good as its weakest element. And at the other extreme, if all these 5 are working at their best, you get an awful lot of synergy, okay? So you need to think of this holistically. And to give you some examples of how route to market is affected, or your decisions on route to market should be affected by how you are market, or affects how you market your brand, here are some. The first 2 I'm not going to talk about. I've mentioned those already, and I'll come back to those points to emphasize them even more later on. The last point, though, the third point, sorry, marketing in essence is about the development and promotion of points of difference. The ideal is to be unique. Now, very few people, of course, are ever unique, but hand selling gives you the greater scope to achieve this. And let me give you an example of this. A few years ago, I went to see a producer who clearly was very anxious about what I thought of their packaging, which was indeed what I would call Marmite packaging, okay? Marmite packaging being you either love it or hate it. And it was extraordinarily quirky, okay? And I got the story behind the packaging. And the question I asked was this: where is this wine going to be sold? And I was told that it was all going to be sold either from the cellar door or locally. And I said, well, in that case, this packaging works brilliantly, okay? This is really so different. It is, well, probably is unique, okay? That is, it will stand out in your region from anything else. Now, if they'd said to me, actually, we haven't got many local sales and we're going to need to sell this in London or possibly even abroad, I would have said, I'm sorry, this packaging is probably not going to work. You're going to have to play by the rules. The further you are from home, unfortunately, the more you need to play by the rules. I talked about your brand, you know, a few thousand miles away, feeling very lonely on a shelf, surrounded by all that competition. And the wine market is, I hardly need to tell you, extraordinarily competitive, okay? And there are some things the consumer will look for. If they're coming to see you at your cellar door, a lot of that goes out of the window. Hence, you should use that opportunity, maximize that opportunity. Another example, just in case I don't mention it at the end, when people are selecting their brand name, well, their brand name may be obvious, but some people need to work at it pretty hard, okay, because it's not that obvious. If you have the view that you're going to be exporting in a few years' time, then you're going to have to think right at the beginning about some of the markets you're going to be in and make sure that that brand name is usable in those markets. You know, I had a terrible experience back many years ago. of wanting to sell a brand in the US and finding that I could not use that name in the US, okay? Extraordinarily embarrassing. So the final chart before we pause for some questions. Developing a sales plan. The themes I've talked about, and here are some key questions that build on that. When I was a mentor and we used to get onto this subject, I used to spend an awful lot on the first question. What are your aspirations in terms of volume? Now, some people are very, very certain about this, you know, and let's take a couple of examples at random here. You know, somebody says, for example, I'm producing, I'm going to maximize, you know, up to 10,000 bottles is going to be fine for me. That's what my vines will produce in a good year, and that'll do me. I do not need any more than that. All my personal aspirations will be achieved by that, assuming, of course, you can sell at whatever price it is in their mind. In that case, I would say, well, your route to market strategy is very clear. Okay, unless you're absolutely in the middle of nowhere, you should be able to sell that all straight direct to the consumer. You don't need to complicate things more than that. Okay. Now, if somebody had said at the other extreme, perhaps, you know, 200,000 bottles or more, I would say you need to start thinking about export now. Now, those volumes I haven't picked them at random, but of course the volumes will depend, as I said, on your price aspirations. They'll depend on where you are and the other aspirations that may be relevant to that. But generally speaking, I hope you see what I'm getting at here. If you, on the other hand, say, if you had said to me, look, I'm really not sure, okay, I'm not quite certain. We're producing about 10,000 now, but I might want to expand. I might want to get to 20 or 30, or somebody producing 50 may say, I want to get to, you know, 150, 200. I really don't know. That's fine too. But in your sales plan, you're going to have to build in various step changes, some kind of transition moments. And the big transition moments are when you move from a volume that you can handle, okay, handle with some growth and some perhaps investment in cellar door facilities or a better website or whatever, but you can handle that through selling direct to consumer, to a volume where you are actually going to need a third party to help you out. And at some point, you're going to possibly need to move from that position to a point where you're going to need to export. Those are very, very big step changes. So when you're planting your vines, even more important that you have an idea that a certain amount of planting will put you into one of those step changes. And that's where your route to market strategy becomes complicated. And that may impact your decision on whether to plant more or not, if you see what I mean, okay? That is possibly, in terms of the process of planning, the most important bit of this presentation, okay? What other aspirations might be relevant? Well, I've talked obviously about your financial aspirations, which are right at the center of this, but you may have things that are more quirky. I remember a producer saying to me, look, you know, I'm nowhere near London, but I go to London quite a lot, and I would love to have my wines in 2 or 3 top restaurants where I could take my friends, and that would make me feel really good. And the impression was they're giving, hey, isn't this a bit self-indulgent? And I would say, look, it's your business. You know, if you've got aspirations like that, you stick them in the plan because they're important to you. Don't be afraid of, don't assume there's some plan that you can kind of pull off the shelf that all successful companies adopt. This is your business. Be as quirky as you like. So I've kind of covered the next 3 points. The step changes are between direct to consumers sales and whether you can supply local trade sales direct, therefore how much you need third party support or indeed to export. And then the last 2 points. How involved do you personally want to be in sales and marketing? You know, this is crucial. If you're a small to medium-sized company, this is a crucial decision you have to make. But all I would advise you, don't think that it's more complicated than it is. Sometimes people think that marketing is you read a book or you go and work for a big company and they'll tell you what marketing is. Well, marketing actually is something that all of us do a lot of the time, okay? Some part of the day we're all marketing ourselves, all right? So it's not actually, in essence, that complicated, and you're probably much better at it than you think you are. So before you delegate, remember the point I made earlier on, that you might be much better at it than you think you are. Okay, at that point, how am I doing for time? Not too bad, okay. At that point, I'm just going to pause for any questions on the broad themes. You can see what I'm going to move on to from now, some of which I will have already covered. I specifically want, though, to talk about wholesaling, which in my view is probably the most complicated part of the mix. But there are other points I want to make as well. But if anybody's got any questions on what I've said so far, then now's please fire away.
Mike, at the moment we haven't got any questions logged. I think it's such a complex subject, and people I think are absolutely wrapped by the slides. One thing that did actually crop up, you mentioned, of course, there could be some credit issues at the moment because everything's been turned on its head.
Yeah.
I suppose that could inspire a sort of, it's easy to sort of perhaps get a knee-jerk reaction to what one should do about changing, if anything, one's route to market at the moment. How wary should we be with sort of dealing with some of the markets, particularly during these changing times? Is there anything that perhaps people should take on board, right now when there is a certain degree of uncertainty out there?
Well, I just make a general point, and a producer mentioned to me the other day that or some of us the other day, that September is the rent review time in a lot of the on-trade, okay, and the on-trade will be coming off furlough as well, probably. So it really is just have your radar out there and be more cautious. I mean, everybody's, I'm sure, is pretty cautious in terms of credit control anyway, but just be even more so, right? I'm not sure I can say any more than that. I mean, the on-trade is going through hell at the moment, and one feels really sorry for them, and I hope they come through, but some of them won't make it, and one doesn't want to get caught up in that.
And I guess that's sort of where your relationships with the people that you supply come in.
Well, that's right, and that's where, as I said, if you're working through a good wholesaler, that's where a wholesaler can really add.
Absolutely. We have had a question come through. How detrimental is customer disappointment with demand outstripping supply?
Customer, well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. In fact, that obviously, if you cannot, it's not just about customer disappointment, it's really disappointing if you're in a business and you're having to turn away sales, okay? I mean, and clearly that is not a great position to be in. So one of the reasons there's been so much planting is because demand is outstripping supply, and presumably those people are then going out to buy something else rather than English wine. Okay, so I can quite understand why people are saying, hey, I can grow significantly, and therefore I'm going to plant vines. So there's no question that this is not a straightforward thing. It's not a question of saying that undersupply is brilliant and oversupply is terrible. Otherwise, nobody would plant. Okay, so yeah, it's and every producer. People talk in general terms about what happened to the Australian industry in the 90s or New Zealand in the early years of this century. There were individual producers who came out of that very strongly. Right? So every producer will come to their own decision about what action they should take. And if you're a small producer, it's quite possible that all kinds of nasty things can be going on on the macro level, which pass you by completely, because actually you're doing extraordinarily well. So I think it's a question of be aware that on a macro level, it may well be that the supply looks as though it's going to eclipse demand. But A, that's an incentive for people to broaden their distribution, either with the help of YNGB or individually, and in a way, there, as this questioner is implying, it prevents an opportunity. Okay, you can't obviously sell wine you don't have. If you have wine, well, the potential is to sell it.
Yeah. That's great, thank you. And another question's come through. I think it might be related to the slide that you've got up when it says add a local or regional distributor. When you say local, do you mean really local, like town and county, so sort of keep it there, rather than sort of further afield? In which case, who do you talk to? Do you go to a local manager, or do you go straight to the head office?
I'm going to come on to that in a minute.
Okay.
Can I suggest I probably press on now?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I will definitely cover that question. Okay?
Yeah, excellent, brilliant. Thank you. No, far away. I'll keep monitoring the questions.
Okay, very good. So now we're going to go through the individual routes to market. Now, I'm not going to cover the points I've covered already, and I also know that some of you will have attended the webinars from Elizabeth Else and others on direct to consumer, okay? So what is the potential of direct from winery sales? That's going to be a key element of your sales plan. Where are you now and where can you get to? Some producers may be thinking, what is the potential region to create a wine trail? At Gusbourne, we're involved in the Wine Garden of England. There's a Surrey Hills group, there's a Hampshire group, there's a Sussex Weald group. It's likely that over the next 5 years, you're going to get a lot of wine trails, a lot of kind of collective initiatives designed to bring increased tourism, to increase numbers of tourists and visitors to the cellar doors. And these wine trails could be linked to hotels, restaurants, attractions. They could be as sophisticated as you want them to be. I think this is a very good thing to be involved in if you're in a kind of natural region where there are other producers, like-minded producers. All I would say is don't underestimate the amount of time it will take. If time is precious to you, all generic collective initiatives take up time. But in my view, this could be very worthwhile. Next point, is your website transactional? Again, obviously it should be. That may be something you've introduced over the last few months. Web sales have generally gone through the roof. And does it do justice to your brand proposition and personality? I do a fair amount of consulting outside the wine business up here with small businesses. And sometimes I meet people who come across are extraordinarily vibrant. There's lots of dynamism there. And I look at their website and it really doesn't reflect that at all. It's too corporate, it's too boring, okay? It just doesn't reflect their personality at all. Well, clearly if that happens, you're underselling yourself. I talked about the importance of being different, okay? Well, your website has a huge possibility of helping you achieve that. What have you learned from other brands, people you admire? Go around and see them. We're a wonderfully open industry in terms of what we're prepared to show. Take advantage of that, learn from other people. How good are you at the front of house bit? Well, I've kind of talked about that. And the last point, how do you become a local hero? Ideally, you want the local people to say, wow, we've got this fantastic winery, vineyards down the road, and they become kind of evangelists for you. Key themes. Again, I've talked about the first 3 points here. Okay, I can't emphasize those enough. The fourth point I think is quite interesting. There is a danger, and it's not just in the wine business, that people neglect their existing customers in their drive to get new customers. It has been estimated that it costs 9 times as much to recruit a new customer as to retain an existing one. I don't know how they calculated that, and that statistic goes way beyond wine, but it sounds right to me. It is really difficult to get new customers, and will become more so as this industry develops and cellar doors are springing up all over the place. We'll be competing much more than we are with ourselves at the moment. Don't neglect your existing customers, but by the same token, don't assume you will keep them forever. In the Napa Valley, which is obviously a very sophisticated direct-to-consumer region. They reckon they keep people for about 18 months, I think the figure is. And then they just get bored. And that's quite natural. I mean, I don't know about you, but I buy wine and I really like the wine. And it's not that it goes off. It's not that I just decide I don't like it anymore. I just get bored buying wine from that producer, okay? And you just want to try something different. So you're going to have, people are going to move and you're going to need to replace them anyway. And again, I'm sure, you don't need this said to you anymore. Take every opportunity to build a database and then communicate it with effectively. Again, when I was a mentor, I was amazed at how many people did not collect data and then didn't come. Those are your existing customers. They bought from you, okay? They are so precious. And then ideally get your customer base, your consumer base, to sell on your behalf, to be evangelists. Keep them engaged, form a wine club, develop a recurrent purchase scheme. Recurrent purchase schemes where people get wine delivered from you on a 3-month basis. They're extraordinarily important in places like Australia, South Africa, California. Have exclusive offers so that they can only get them by becoming part of your wine club. Focus on your points of difference and tell interesting stories, and don't just focus on the wine itself. People are not as interested in wine as you might think, okay? This is so important. We tend to think in wine, and I'm no different than anyone else. When people say they're fascinated about wine, and could I tell them about this wine or that wine when you're out to dinner, you soon find out that they're not that fascinated, okay? They were happy for a couple of minutes, but the last thing they want to hear about, not that I would be talking about it, the last thing they want to be talking about is things like malolactic fermentation or volatile acidity or whatever. They're not as interested as we are in the wine business. And your stories should reflect that. Your website is your showpiece, as is social media. So I've made that point already. Ideally, third-party promotion is better than first-party promotion. I'm sure that's clear. And use your Solidor website as a research tool. Okay, it is so valuable once you've got a customer base. You can involve your consumers in your brand. Maximize the localness factor. I've talked about that. Link with local premium food producers, weddings, events, and obviously if you have awards, use them. Use the awards. You may think after a while, oh, I win these awards. Do they actually make any difference? Well, all the research indicates that if a consumer is given the choice between a wine that hasn't won an award and has won an award, they'll take wine with an award. It means possibly more than one thinks it might. Pricing. Okay. Now, the important thing here, whatever you decide to price, there is no right or wrong price, okay? That will reflect your aspirations, your reading of the market or whatever. But remember that your Solidor website pricing is a statement of your market positioning. If, for example, you're talking to a wholesaler and you've arranged a meeting and they want to know something about you before you come in, they will look at your website. They will look at how you price yourself and the look and feel of your website more generally, but the pricing is vital because they'll be doing some calculations there, okay? So it's such an important statement. So think very carefully before you set the price. Now, the higher the price, obviously, the more flexibility it gives you when you're talking about trade pricing, okay? Because if you're going to go to a wholesaler, they are going to take into account the retail price. But of course, the higher the price, also the volume may suffer. Your volume may suffer. This is a balance. As I said, there is no right or wrong pricing. Remember, though, it is difficult to increase prices, and the longer you are established at a certain price, the more difficult it becomes. In marketing terms, we call this a KVI. You become a known value item, and the longer you're the more known you are at a price, the more difficult it becomes to increase it. So when you're working on your pricing strategy at the very beginning of your journey, then think about that. And remember at the bottom, the fundamental rule of pricing in marketing terms. The correct price for something is the price somebody is prepared to pay. And the wine itself is just one element of the mix. Remember what I said earlier about the consumer who comes to your winery, comes to your vineyards and meets you, the sun is shining. That is when your brand is, your wine is at its highest value. And they like the wine, but it's not just about the wine. It's about the whole experience at your cellar door, okay? So it's the price somebody is prepared to pay is not simply about what the wine is cost you, plus whatever. A cost plus basis is not the way to work on pricing. You've got to think what somebody might be prepared to pay for your wine. So that's the direct-to-consumer bit. Now we get on to something which is more complicated. Complicated in the sense this is an area in which people have less control, okay? Because you may decide that you're going to do the local trade business direct. Okay? One of the first things you should do is say, right, what is the potential for me supplying, in addition to consumers coming direct to me, what is the potential for supplying local hotels, restaurants, etc.? Okay, really look at that, because obviously if you can do that as direct, you're going to, again, you'll keep the through profit and you can control the message. You can do that selling direct. But at a certain point, you're clearly, it's not going to be, unless you could take on a salesperson, okay? But or are you at some point going to need a distributor? And this is a step change in your route to market plan that you need to consider very carefully. If you're going to take on a distributor, this is a complicated process to find. Not only have you got to have one that you really like, but you've obviously got to find somebody who really likes you, okay? And as the English market gets more and more crowded, the more complicated that's going to be. 10 years ago, or when I came into the industry, I remember doing a survey of the top 10 national distributors. And only one of them, I think, had an English wine. Okay. And I think they had two. The rest didn't have any. And nor at that point were they particularly interested in taking on one when I asked them the question. Now, they all represent at least one. So if you wanted a national distributor now, one of the things you're going to possibly have to do is persuade them either to kick out somebody else or to add them to their list, right? So it's becoming more competitive, and the same is probably true at a local level too. I don't know, obviously, which areas you're in. Every locality is different. But to answer the question that came up, a local regional distributor can mean exactly what you want it to mean. You may decide that you want to go with a kind of one-man band who operates just in a kind of 10-mile radius of your property. You may decide you want somebody who works in the county or indeed covers 2 or 3 counties. Every region is different. Some have more choice than others. The structure of this wonderful trade that we live in is extraordinarily complicated. Some regional wholesalers also sell in London, okay? In fact, an awful lot of people sell in London that are not London based. And if you want to find out, a quick way of finding out who the best local distributors are, because I'm using the term distributor and wholesaler, you know, in the same way, is go to a local hotel, go to a local restaurant that you really like, or 2 or 3 that you really like, and find out who is supplying them, okay? Find out who is supplying them. Find out who they value, who they think is a good distributor or wholesaler. That is the best way. Do your own market research, and then go and have a chat to that wholesaler. Ideally, if you've newly planted or you're about to plant some more, and that means you're going to have to change your strategy in a couple of years' time, ideally in good time, not as a response, as I said earlier, to suddenly finding you've got a lot of wine you need to sell. Why would you use distributors? Obviously, their knowledge and experience of the marketplace, and of course, you can learn from them. Their customer base, their logistics, customer service support, credit control risk, have talked about their contacts, opinion formers may be useful to you in the region, journalists, wine press. And if you develop real empathy with the distributor, the relationship, as I said, can be very, very powerful indeed. The disadvantages, clearly they take a margin. I've got something on margins later on, but they vary hugely. They vary hugely. And managing them takes time. The larger they are, the more diverse their range, the harder you have to work to get focus. If somebody is selling 400 wines, you're going to have to work very hard to get them to focus on you, however much they like you, okay? It can therefore be a trade-off between focus and market power. Ideally, you want both. You want somebody who's going to spend a lot of time with you, who really gets you and has an extraordinary amount of market power, okay? The risk is you get that personal attention and focus, but they can't do a job for you. They may be able to take you to a certain stage, but you know that in 3 or 4 years' time, you're going to probably need to go to another wholesaler as well, a bigger wholesaler. And then you're going to have, as we'll come on to talk about in a minute, the sensitivities of how do you work if you've got more than one wholesaler. Okay, we'll come to that in a minute. And they probably, I'm not being too hard on wholesalers because some of them are, a lot of them are excellent. All I'm saying is that you're probably underestimating how good you are at selling your own brand, because you're going to be the best at it, however good they are. Sensitivities to be aware of. Now, this is a long list, and a lot of people have fallen down. And when I say a lot of people, again, I'm not talking specifically about English producers. There's a long list of people, international producers, who have fallen foul of these sensitivities. Okay. The first one is pretty straightforward. Let's say you're selling to a number of local outlets, and then you appoint a local distributor. And that distributor is probably supplying some of those local outlets already. So you need to come to an arrangement with them. Who is going to supply the local outlets then? If it is you, then you clearly need to have a clear operating strategy. One of the things that really annoys wholesalers is if you come to an arrangement with them, and then they find that you are selling direct to one of their customers. Okay. Now you may say, well, I wouldn't do that, okay, but it does happen. It does happen. And what happens if they have a sales force and they find that kind of thing is going on? Well, what happens? The sales force just switch off. They don't want to be embarrassed in that respect. So I make this point at the end. It's best to try to avoid getting the best of all worlds. Find a clear operating strategy, okay, and then stick to it. There's got to be a level of trust here. This can be tricky, okay? Don't pretend I'm making this sound as though it's an easy thing to avoid. Imagine if you've got a really good hotel customer who comes to you and they say, I really want to buy your wine direct. And you say, well, you're getting it through a wholesaler. And they say, no, but I want to buy it direct. Why can't I sell it to you direct? Okay, and that conversation can get very difficult. So, I'm not pretending it's easy. If you appoint more than one distributor, how do you deal with any, overlap? If you appoint, for example, a regional distributor and then decide you're going to appoint a national distributor a couple of years later, that national distributor will say to you, look, I've got salespeople in your region. Why don't you, say thanks very much to a regional distributor and just give me all the business? And you feeling particularly loyal to your regional distributor who's done a good job. And you've already got complications because you're also selling direct to a few outlets. And your regional distributor respects that. So you need to have a view of what you're going to say to your national distributor. And it's not for me to say what you should say to them. But I hope I'm making the point that the complications of getting into third-party distribution don't stop or start when you appoint just one local distributor. Again, it all comes back to your long-term aspirations about how complicated you want your route to market strategy to be. Remember too, the sensitivities of selling to the off-trade with the same label as the on-trade. Right? This is something that a lot of people can go wrong with. Now, some people are not as sensitive as others. I'm not saying you can't do this or you can't do that, but be aware there are sensitivities here, okay? And again, the same sensitivity about selling to the independent off-trade and to supermarket outlets in the same town. That can well cause friction too, okay? Ideally in the wine world, because there is so much wine available in the world, you get the impression that every restaurant, every hotel, every supermarket, every independent off-license would like an exclusive range over which they would have control. Everybody wants control. You want control of how your wine is sold and marketed. So does a retailer. It's quite natural to want that. And because there are so many wines, so many labels around, and again, I'm not talking English wine specifically here, then actually the possibility exists to achieve that, okay? So you have to manage that. Other points relating to distributors. Some people make the mistake of thinking, hey, I've got a listing, you know, that's it, kind of job done. Listings should never be confused with sales. You know, the wine needs to move off the shelf or the wine list. The retailer, on or off trade, is just a conduit. They're not there to make your wine sell. Obviously, they hope your wine sells because they make a margin on that. Okay, but it's not your job. It's your job to make it sell, either directly or indirectly. And this implies focus and promotion. Okay, so what you want really is to possibly incentivize the independent shop owner, you know, so that they actually focus on the product. They don't put it on the shelf and say good luck. Right? Same with the on-trade. Securing exclusivity is the ideal. Ideally, as I've kind of said earlier on, you want an operator who's only going to sell your product, okay, your English wine. Right? But that brings with it responsibility. Let's say, and this comes back to the question earlier on, you haven't got enough wine. Then the operator is going to say, look, I need more English wine than that. If you can't give me any more wine, then I'm going to need to extend my listings. And remember, exclusivity usually works well. It works both ways. A wholesaler may give you exclusivity, but he expects you to give him exclusivity too, okay, and not sell to possibly other wholesalers or retailers in the region. So develop a clear operating framework and put it in writing, even if it's only a one-pager. You may get on brilliantly with somebody, but you may well need to refer to this at some point. And within that, have a clear pricing and promotional strategy. Regularly reassess your goals together and work actively with distributors. One of the fantastic things about English wine is that a wholesaler can take their customers to see you. You're only probably just down the road. They can't. It's much more difficult to take them to France or Spain or anywhere else. You know, they can actually take their customers to a winery in this country. Okay, now not long ago, that really wasn't possible. It is amazing to think how this country, our countryside, has been transformed. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of that. Margins, okay. I'll put a bit about margins here. As I said, this is just a guide. They vary hugely. I'm not going to, you know, comment any more on that. And again, I've used some, for illustration purposes, I've just taken a sparkling wine selling at £25 and a still wine selling at £15. The £25, that just happens to be the average price from the research done by Wine Intelligence last year, that our sparkling wine UK English sparkling wine is retailing at the moment. Still wine, I'm not sure what the average price is, but this is how a retailer would calculate their margin, assuming, as I said, there are lots of assumptions in here. It's just a guide, very much a guide. Finally, how am I doing for time? Right, okay. Selling internationally, all I want to say is this. I realize that probably a lot of you are not exporting or possibly even thinking about exporting. I'm a great planner, but in terms of export, it may well be that you just want to be opportunistic, and that is the right thing to be. You know, it may just be that export should be a safety valve. What I'm not going to say is, look, say, I don't know, somebody from Finland comes along and happened to have heard of you and wants to buy in a pallet of wine. You're not really, and it's a kind of one-off. My view is you don't need to do an awful lot of research, providing, of course, you know that they're going to pay you. You don't really need to do a lot of research into the Finnish market that you might want to do if export was going to be a serious strategic initiative for you. Okay, that's all I'm saying. It's okay, is what I'm saying, to have an opportunistic export strategy if that fits into your overall sales plan. Export, use WineGB. There's a very good export committee on WineGB. A lot of developments there, a lot of information. If it's sparkling wine, I would suggest you focus on markets with large champagne sales, because they've obviously got a history of spending good money on sparkling wine. Clearly, and where the term British and English adds value. Markets could be cities, not countries, particularly perhaps in somewhere like the US. I've talked about the trademarking thing. Finding the right distributor is even more important, I would argue, than in the UK, and the same rules would apply. You really need that empathy, you really need that passion and focus. And the reason it's more important, because it's a long way away, further away, and the market is very, very different. You may find in a few years or even less than that, you really understand exactly how the UK market works, but you've got no idea really how the French market or the German market works, and nor have you got particular time to look at that. So you need a distributor who you trust completely, who you feel is the right one for that market. Exchange rate fluctuations, that's a huge complication, obviously, when you're working abroad. Ensure you understand the pricing dynamics. Crucially, every market is different. You have to assume that every market has different add-on costs and different pricing dynamics, different views about English wine, and work collectively. The other producers, with other producers, there's lots of export initiatives kicking off. And it tends to be the case, which is logical, that producers tend to compete less against each other when abroad, because there's a common market we're going for. And that is that. So thanks very much for listening. I've talked for rather longer than I thought. I hope for not for too long. I think I'll say stop sharing now, do I?
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
That's great. Mike, thank you so much. Not unsurprisingly, a hugely meaty and very complex subject to cover in a very relatively short space of time. We can just squeeze in a couple of questions that have come through. One is from Katie Duke. Hello, we have excess stock, around 5,000 bottles of still white 2018 still white wine. It's a blend of mainly Ortega and St. Bacchus, which are in unlabeled bottles. How would you recommend selling this excess stock? She hasn't clarified whether there's a need to have some why she wants to keep it separate from her other branding, but might she be able to help with that? So excess stock, still white 2018 wine, so very current unlabeled bottles. How would you recommend selling this excess stock?
Well, I guess the easy answer is to put something like that on the forum. Isn't it? I mean, the forum, it seems to me, is used for that kind of thing. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. People will say they've got this or that to sell. That would be the easiest answer. I mean, obviously, the forum is just English producers. If you're looking to sell that, I mean, I think that's one answer. The second answer, which is easy for me to say, is I think I'd need to have more information about where you were, and I mean, again, if you want to email me separately, might be the best response to that.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you. Another one that's come through is: do you know how much of the marketing activity that distributors do, if any, as part of their margin? What's the extent of their marketing activity on your behalf?
I think that would vary hugely. I mean, what I would say is I would suggest you definitely attend the webinar next week, which is going to be all about wholesale, and there's going to be a regional distributor, wholesaler, and a national one there, and that's exactly the kind of question they should be asking. I mean, my view is that every wholesaler is different, just like every producer is different. If you ask producers how much they spend on marketing, everybody's answer will be different. And it's the same for a distributor. Sorry, I can't be more helpful, but I suggest next week you might get more from the panel on that.
Specifically about distributors, exactly. Because one question that also came out is how much will you be expected to be involved? And again, I guess that's going to vary from distributor to distributor, won't it?
Well, I think that is a very good. I mean, most distributors really want you to be involved, okay? And you should get involved to the point where actually they're having to ring you up and say, look, Mike, would you kind of back off a bit because you're taking up too much of our sales force's time or my time or whatever. Get to that point, really. But up to a point, all distributors will say that is fantastic. Particularly, as I've said, the big advantage is that they can bring their customers to see a real, vineyards just down the road, possibly. Or if they're, I don't know, in London and get on a train, it's a fantastic outing for their sommeliers, rather than having to get on a plane and go abroad. Okay, yeah. So get involved. It really is one of the huge advantages we have in the UK, that we can do that, and it's possibly something we take for granted.
And I suppose that does help create demand, because I remember some years, admittedly it was a few years ago now, a wholesaler friend of mine said, well, we don't really have, our sales of English wine aren't that high because there's not much demand. But then it's turning it round to, as you said, you've got to help create that demand. Well,
you do have to create a bit, but I would hope they wouldn't be saying that now. I mean, having said that, it's amazing how many consumers you meet who actually have never bought a bottle of English wine, even though they buy lots of wine. Okay. And there is a huge job to be done there, but we are a lot further forward than we were a few years ago, and it's growing exponentially.
And you mentioned social media, and in fact, that's where this has really opened up some opportunities to engage with your resellers, isn't it? Be it distributors, be it retailers you're selling into. Engage with them on social media every bit as much as offering a helping hand in some way or another.
Well, yes, I mean, this is the perfect market, to come back to the point I made earlier, where the consumer and the trade and you can work as an almost perfect triangle, because the consumer can come to you directly, okay, but then goes to a restaurant to buy your wine or another English wine or whatever, and everybody benefits from that. As I said, the greatest value we have is when people come to the winery, right? And that means very few English consumers can go to wineries abroad, okay? And when they do, they come back and get very excited about it. But all English consumers can find, when I say winery, sorry, I'm really talking about a cellar door vineyard, probably even more than a winery. Everybody's got one now. Every consumer in the UK has probably got vineyard within, I don't know, 10 miles. Maybe 50 miles if you're in the far-flung north. I don't know.
Absolutely. Mike, I see that numbers are starting to drop simply because it's gone past the hour. Have had some lovely words of thanks as well, which is terrific. Thank you. I'm so glad this has been a very helpful session. As mentioned before, people can contact you. So what we might make available to those that have registered is your contact detail, if that's okay. Lots to have taken on board today, and just to remind you that this will be recorded for people to be able to view again, and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. Just a quick reminder to everybody, those that are still there, is that this is, as we said, the first of 3 webinars that's really focusing on routes to market. So the next one is next Tuesday, the 14th. That's going to be looking at distributors, and we're going to have a local and a national distributor on the panel. The week after that, it's about selling into the retailers, and we'll have someone from multiple, a supermarket, and an independent as well. Both those, slightly different format. They're going to be chaired by Simon Thorpe, Master of Wine, who's got terrific experience in both sectors, actually. So I think those are going to be really interesting. It'll be a bit like a sort of question time panel as well. So do tune into there. All the details, of course, are on the WineGB website. So really that leaves me just to say a huge thank you to Mike. Thank you. Those are really informative slides. There's a lot to learn there, a lot to glean from them as well, and your words of wisdom as ever. So very many thanks to everybody who've attended, and have a very good evening, and we hope to see you in future webinars. Thanks very much. Thanks again,
very
Mike.
much. Thanks for listening. I enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.